everybody. My name is Alex Matsuo, and I'm going to be chatting with you about spooky women of history for Anomicon. And I definitely want to thank Ryan for having me on here, and I can't wait for you to meet these amazing women. So let's get started. All right. So a little bit about me. My name, again, is Alex Matsuo. My pronouns are she, they. I am the founder and director of the Association of Paranormal Study. I also run the blog, The Spooky Stuff. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, the whole social media thing. And I have my MA in Theater Arts from San Diego State University, go Aztecs, and I currently live in the DC metro area. And of course, shameless plug, I did write a book about this topic. So if you enjoy this presentation, you want to learn more about the various women in paranormal history, then check out my book, Women of the Paranormal, Volume 1, A Brief History. So you can check that out on Amazon, and let's get rolling. All right, I'm just going to jump right in here. So first woman I'm going to talk about is Catherine Crowe. Catherine Crowe was born as Catherine Ann Stevens in 1790 to a middle-class family. This family had made their fortune in the hospitality business. So Catherine was educated at home in Kent, and actually very little is known about her early life, but what we do know is that in 1822, she married Major John Crowe and had a son the following year. The marriage, sadly, was an unhappy one for Catherine, and she did ask friends to help her escape in 1833. So there's some pretty strong evidence that Catherine was a survivor of domestic abuse. So after Catherine managed to get out, she did move to Edinburgh and she made her living through writing, and she actually was met with some fairly significant success. Her big hit, though, her big hit was The Night Side of Nature, which she published in 1848. This book was such a huge success that it went through 16 print runs. And in my opinion only, well, I think others share this too, but I think this is one of the most important pieces of text for paranormal historians and paranormal researchers and investigators. Why? Well, Catherine was the first person to bring poltergeist and doppelganger into English usage. And if you're around the paranormal community, then you probably have heard these words before. It was Catherine that had brought this into English usage. She did extensive research on various topics in the supernatural, and it's fairly remarkable when you read it just exactly how much she did. And oop, I went a little too far there. So um but a lot of the research she did and how she put it down to paper, we would describe a lot of the phenomena that she talks about as like ESP, crisis apparitions, out of body experiences, near death experiences. Uh, there's so much in this text, and you can read it for free. Project Gutenberg has it. You can get a print copy on Amazon by some random people who put it into text. But yeah, I definitely recommend checking out The Night Side of Nature if you're a paranormal person of any involvement. You probably see Charles Dickens here. What does Charles Dickens have to do with this? Well, when The Night Side of Nature was published, it was met with critical acclaim, including Charles Dickens gave it high amounts of praise. And at some point, he and Catherine Crowe were colleagues. However, something went amiss. So in 1854, there is a story that is more than likely exaggerated. It was said that Catherine Crowe was found wandering the streets of Edinburgh naked, carrying a handkerchief and a card case, believing herself to be invisible because the spirits told her so. The story was widely reported and discussed with the help of Charles Dickens writing letters to his friends. In numerous letters, he described her as stark mad and stark naked and clothed only in her chastity. Uh, Catherine, when she found out about this, she wrote to the local newspapers, especially in London. And what was sad about this was she was in Edinburgh when the rumors were being spread. It wasn't until she got to London that she realized this huge rumor was going on about her. And so she was writing to the press, begging them to correct the story. And she did say that she was ill with some sort of gastroenteritis, some sort of stomach issue, and had a fever. But what she said was, this, I did have a high fever for a couple days, but I don't think this happened. This didn't happen. Can you please, take back the story? Um, so think of it as a rumor gets started on Twitter and then it makes it to the National Enquirer, but then CNN picks up the story from the National Enquirer as fact. That's essentially what happened to Catherine. And what's interesting is that the United Kingdom did release all of their patient records from, I think they started at like the late 1700s to, current, I think up to, I want to say mid 1900s, maybe a little earlier than that. But they released patient records in the UK. So that included Edinburgh, Scotland. And here's the thing, Catherine's name is not on the docket. There are a couple of Catherine Stevens, but at this point, Catherine Crowe had been living as Catherine Crowe. So also the dates didn't quite line up with the claim from Dickens. Um, and I went too far again. I'm just really eager. But then the other thing was, so this means that Catherine was not admitted into an asylum like Charles Dickens had also said in the letters. So that's a whole new story. But then there was a man named Robert Chambers who apparently was Catherine's neighbor at the time. He confirmed the story, but evidence strongly suggests that he did not see the incident. So, and here's the other thing, Robert Chambers and Dickens were friends. So there's a good chance that the story was widely made up, or if anything, was very much exaggerated, thanks to Charles Dickens. And this took a big hit into Catherine's career, quite a hit. But it seemed that she didn't really let this stop her. So, which brings me into this one, Ghosts and Family Legends, 1859. Now, the Stark Mad and Stark Naked incident happened in 1854. She comes out with Ghosts and Family Legends in 1859. So, in my opinion, and the opinion again of others, is that this is the first documented paranormal investigation in the final chapter of Ghosts and Family Legends. So, the way the book is laid out is Catherine is at a party with her friends. Each chapter is of them telling like a spooky story. And at the end of the book, they're asking Catherine, hey, can you tell us a story? And Catherine pretty much says, like, hey, if you want to know anything spooky, look into the night side of nature. And they're like, no, 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 that's not good enough. Tell us more. So, after Night Side of Nature came out, this is the story that Catherine told, there was a gentleman known by the alias McN that had reached out to Catherine about his own haunted estate. And what's interesting about it is that he had written a letter to Catherine. Catherine wrote back, and essentially, to bring it all together, Catherine ended up conducting an investigation at McN's house. What's interesting is that she brought a pretty much a team of people with her, including a psychic medium. And what's delightful about this is that she did not tell the psychic medium why she was the real reason why she was there. She had told her psychic medium friend that she was thinking about buying this house and that she would love to know what the psychic medium thought of said house. Um, so, long story short, they end up experiencing paranormal activity. The psychic medium reported seeing like light anomalies and light streaks. Catherine couldn't see it, but then when the psychic medium grabbed Catherine's hand, Catherine then could see it. So, what's really interesting about this is that everything that Catherine is doing, we would know that today as a paranormal investigation. She did her research, she investigated, she brought in a psychic medium who did not have a bias, so who didn't know what was going on there. She was asking questions in the space, she was taking down baseline readings, she was essentially paranormal investigating. And what's really interesting about Catherine's work is that it did end up setting a foundation for the Society for Psychical Research. So, Catherine made a significant contribution to the paranormal field, but because of this whole scandal that had happened to her in 1854, fueled by Charles Dickens, her legacy was tarnished. Thankfully, though, more awareness of Catherine Crowe has surfaced. I first learned about Catherine Crowe in 2011 when I was doing a poltergeist talk for my team, Association of Paranormal Study, because I read Night Side of Nature, because I was trying to find, early indications of poltergeist, some sort of early evidence, and I ran into Night Side of Nature. So I didn't read Ghosts and Family Legends until maybe 5 years ago. So, which I don't know why I waited so long. This is another one I highly recommend reading. You'll find it quite interesting. All right, let's move on to Helen Peters Nosworthy. So, how many of you have heard of a Ouija board? All right. So, a Ouija board is pretty much the branded, trademark, commercialized version of a spirit board. Where does Helen Peters Nosworthy fit into this? Well, Helen was the sister in law of one of the Ouija's co founders, Elijah Bond. What's also really interesting about Helen is that she named the Ouija board and she was a shareholder in the Kenner Novelty Company, which produced the Ouija board. As we know, this board brings about both feelings of excitement and hesitancy. Um, but what is disappointing to know is that Helen's name was all nearly erased from the history of the Ouija board. She was discovered by Robert Murch after he'd read letters from the Baltimore Sun from the founders of the Ouija board. So Charles Kennard mentions a Miss Peters, Bond's sister-in-law, and describes her as a strong medium. So Elijah Bond was married to Helen's sister, Mary. Um, so because Helen had demonstrated herself as a strong medium, Bond was bringing her to shareholder meetings and even the patent office because she was able to demonstrate the power of the Ouija board. So it was Helen who had asked the board what it wanted to be named in April of 1890. And then the board spelled out Ouija. And when she asked the board what it meant, it responded with good luck. Now, of course, we don't know, does that good luck mean, oh, good luck? Or was that what the word really meant? Although, if you look at Ouija now, it's we, like French and yes, and ja, 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 in German, yes in German. So there could be a couple things happening there. So with Helen, though, she ended up resenting the board because she believed that the Ouija board itself was responsible for a massive family feud. So Helen ended up marrying Ernest Herbert Nosworthy. And then she kind of disappeared into obscurity. She adopted a daughter. She was a little bit older than Ernest as well. Um, but what's also interesting about Ernest is that his mother may have been a British spiritualist by the name of E. Louisa Thompson Nosworthy. So it's like the spookiness, the spiritualist aspect of all of this, the psychic mediumship still remained and was still connected, so to speak. Now, I do want to address this. So the naming of the board. So I mentioned just a minute ago that Helen was the one who asked the board what it wanted to be named. But the naming of the Ouija board is much more nuanced because Helen wore a locket that said Ouida. I'm going to call it Ouida in script. Now, Ouida was the pen name of a feminist British author by the name of Maria Louise Ramée. Women who wore lockets of Ouida were known to be forward thinking and unconventional. Now, some believe that Charles Kennard misread Helen's locket when she showed them the charm. So, after the whole OUIJA thing came about, Helen was like, well, wait, I have a locket um, that says, Ouida on it. And trying to basically, I don't know if it was to debunk or just make aware of, hey, this is something that could be connected. But so some believe Kennard misread Helen's locket when she showed them the charm, while others believe that the naming of the Ouija board was a subtle nod to one of the most important feminists of Helen's time. So if there's anything you get from this presentation, know that the Ouija board may have a very strong tie to feminist roots, which could be a good thing or a bad thing for some people. So on September 22nd, 2018, the Talking Board Historical Society dedicated a monument to Helen's grave in the Fairmount Cemetery in Denver, Colorado, celebrating her contributions to the Ouija board. So honestly, we have Robert Murch to thank with bringing Helen's name to light, and also the Talking Board Historical Society, which is Rob Murch's organization. Okay. Oh, here's probably my favorite one. Meet the lesbian power couple of the paranormal. Yes, you heard that right. Lesbian power couple. This was an accidental discovery for my book research. So meet Radcliffe Hall and Una Trowbridge. What did they do in the paranormal? So while Radcliffe Hall is best known for her book, The Well of Loneliness, which was a groundbreaking piece of lesbian literature, she was also involved in psychical research, and she was born on August 12th, 1880. So Radcliffe Hall's identity has been a point of discussion and debate for centuries, not centuries, for decades. And because Radcliffe Hall identified as a man in a woman's body, but Radcliffe Hall also went by she, her pronouns. Now, granted, acknowledging pronouns is still a fairly-ish new thing in our society. Back in Radcliffe's time, not so much. But there is some speculation that Radcliffe Hall may or may not have been trans back when they were alive. Now, Una, let's talk about Una Trowbridge. Una Trowbridge was born March 8th, 1887. Um, Radcliffe and Una got together in a very interesting way that I'll talk about in a moment. But Una, also known as Lady Vicenzo, was a very prominent artist of her time. Very prominent artist. Now, Una and Radcliffe were a couple. They were a known couple in the Society for Psychical Research. Now, we've seen Radcliffe and we've seen Una. I mean, these two individuals were not in the closet. They were very much out there and known. So, um, which means that Radcliffe and Una had their share of pushback as a lesbian couple in SPR. After they started researching a psychic medium by the name of Gladys Osborne Leonard, communicating with the spirit of Radcliffe's ex, named Mabel Batten, also known as Lady. Mabel Batten's daughter complained to SPR that their relationship tainted their research methods. And then also in 1920, SPR member George Lane Fox accused Radcliffe and Una of writing an immoral paper. Now, Radcliffe and Una did sue for slander and they won. All right, so I mentioned Mabel Batten. Let's talk about who she was and why she's so important in this story. So, after Radcliffe's girlfriend, Mabel Batten, passed away, Radcliffe became really interested in spiritualism and the thoughts of reincarnation. So, Radcliffe and Una became council members for the Society for Psychical Research, and they were tipped off in investigating. Radcliffe was initially tipped off in investigating Gladys Osborne Leonard. Somebody had written to Radcliffe Hall saying, "Hey, you should really look into Gladys Osborne Leonard." So Radcliffe was like, "Okay." So Radcliffe goes to a sitting with Gladys Osborne Leonard, Mrs. Osborne Leonard, and during that session, Gladys, I'm going to call her Gladys, starts saying things that no one else would have known except for Radcliffe and Mabel. Like Gladys started talking about a house where Mabel and Radcliffe spent a lot of time together. And Radcliffe was intrigued at this point. They initially thought that, hey, maybe Mrs. Osborne Leonard really did make contact with Mabel. So here's a picture of Gladys Osborne Leonard. Now I forgot like the juiciest part in all of this. So Mabel Batten was Una's cousin. So when Mabel was on her deathbed and getting ready to pass away, Una came into the picture and Radcliffe and Una initiated a relationship. So there seemed to be a little bit of maybe some guilt there. It's an awkward love triangle at play. But so after Radcliffe Hall has this sitting with Gladys Osborne Leonard, Radcliffe is intrigued and wants to do more. So they bring in Una. And so the three of them end up doing like sittings together for several months. And it was SPR member Oliver Lodge who encouraged Radcliffe and Una to write about the experience. And ultimately, Radcliffe and Una walked away from the experience believing that Mabel was giving them advice from beyond. So they wrote about their investigation and they presented it to SPR. The piece is in volume 30, part 78 of the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, and it's called On a Series of Sittings with Mrs. Osborne Leonard. All right, let's switch gears. Let's talk about Alexander David Neal. And I'm not just a big fan of Alexander David Neal because we have similar names. Alexandra was a Belgian French explorer, writer, Buddhist practitioner, and she traveled extensively in Tibet and other parts of Asia. She is probably best known for dressing up as a monk and traveling throughout Tibet, which at the time was forbidden territory for Western women. So she spent quite a bit of time over there. I'll get into that a little bit more. But Alexandra's books about her travels include My Journey to Lhasa, Magic and Mystery in Tibet. These books were bestsellers, and they introduced the Western world to Buddhism and provided firsthand accounts of the Tibetan region and culture. Alexandra was very much interested in Eastern philosophy and religion, and she wrote extensively about this. She also wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine of Tibet, um, and then she also introduced the Western world to, this is why she's here, tulpas and thought forms. So Alexandra's work on tulpas and thought forms has been controversial, with some people believing that she was just making up stories and others believing she was describing something very much real. So, regardless of how people feel about that, her work has been influential in the Western world, and it's helped popularize the idea of tulpas and thought forms, which has made an impact in paranormal research. So, funny thing about I did want to say funny thing about Alexandra. When she went on her adventures in Tibet. I mean, she was if you there's extensive biographies written about her, but she was married when she left, and I think she told her husband she was going to be gone for like 14 months, and then she ended up being gone for like 19 years. So it's fun times. Anyway, it was a long time she was gone from her husband. All right, Dr. Florence Barrett, also known as Lady Barrett, she primarily had a medical background, and she had an approach to psychical research was very much filled with skepticism. So she actually wasn't really involved in this world, if that makes sense. She was a world-renowned gynecologist. She was an obstetrician. She was the dean of the London School of Medicine for Women. She was an honorary surgeon at the Marie Curie Hospital. She was part of the original team of women who set up the investigation of the therapeutic potential of radium in the treatment of cervical and uterine cancers, which she's incredible. Now, she kind of was a fan of eugenics, but we just kind of overlook that a little bit and maybe say, oh, it's a product of her time. But that is one bit of a downside for her. But so, how did this world renowned medical doctor get into the world of parapsychology? Well, her second husband was Sir William Barrett, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. So after William Barrett passed away in 1925, Dr. Barrett had received a letter from a member of SPR. So William Barrett passed away in May of 1925. Dr. Barrett had gotten the letter from the SPR member in June. Um, because apparently, and this member believed that William Barrett was coming through during a sitting with Gladys Osborne Leonard, who was the psychic medium that Radcliffe Hall and Una Trowbridge investigated. So Dr. Barrett was intrigued by the letter. So she scheduled a sitting with Mrs. Osborne Leonard in July of 1925. Apparently, this sitting was incredible, and Dr. Barrett walked away from that strongly believing that Mrs. Osborne Leonard had conversed with her husband, and then proceeded to do several more sittings in a span of 11 years that took place every few months. So she recorded these sittings and she put them together in a book called Personality Survives Death. And William Barrett is a posthumous co-author, and this was published in 1937. You can still get this book even to this day. And so, what Dr. Barrett wanted to do was she wanted to provide credible written accounts of spirit communication to validate the existence of consciousness survival, or with Dr. Barrett's case, survival of personality, which I think there's a difference between consciousness and personality in some ways. Now, Dr. Barrett died in 1945, and as a final act of benefiting parapsychology, she donated her husband's library to SPR. Today, there is a maternity ward at the Royal Free Hospital that does bear her name, which I think is an appropriate honor for all the work she did for women of her time. All right, next one is Dr. Shafika Karagula. So you'll be thrilled to know why she's important. So she wrote extensively about extrasensory perception, also known as ESP, and she was a pioneer in the work of parapsychology, and her work helped to legitimize the study of ESP in the scientific community. She's also the aunt of Coast to Coast AM's George Norrie. And she heavily inspired his journey in the paranormal and the supernatural. She was born in Turkey in 1914, and she studied medicine at the American University in Beirut. And then she went on to specialize in psychiatry in Scotland. Again, Edinburgh coming up. She took her residency at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital for Mental and Nervous Disorders. She also was not a fan of electroshock therapy, so I'm already a big fan of her. Um, then in 1956, she moved to the United States as a practicing physician, and she became an assistant professor in psychiatry at State University of New York. Um, so not only did she study ESP, but she also studied telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and she did experiments with both children and adults. And she found that ESP abilities were much more common than what she originally thought. She wrote several books, including Breakthrough to Creativity, Your Higher Sense Perception, and The Chakras and the Human Energy Fields. Her work really helped change the way that people thought about ESP. And she showed that ESP was very much a real phenomenon. And she really helped legitimize the study of parapsychology. And her work continues to be influential today. And she's considered to be one of the pioneers of ESP research. Oh, this is one of my favorites. So, this is Rose Mackenberg, also known as Mac. Rose Mackenberg was Harry Houdini's most prominent undercover agent who helped him expose fraudulent mediums. So, Harry Houdini, we all know who Harry Houdini is, and he played a huge role in debunking fraudulent mediums. And so, what he would do is that he would basically come up with a team of secret agents and they would go out to towns like a few weeks before Houdini was supposed to come in, and they would investigate the local mediums, and then they would invite those mediums to Harry Houdini shows and then expose them in front of the town. It was a very controversial approach. Um, so in the 2 years that Mac Rose worked for Houdini, she helped expose more than 300 psychics who were taking advantage of people. And even after Houdini passed away, she continued to expose and debunk fake mediums for decades. And so, to ensure that these mediums didn't recognize her, she would wear she would wear costumes. She wore costumes and disguises using pseudonyms like Francis Roud, which would come up to F. Roud, fraud, and Alicia Bunk, all is bunk. Um, yeah, so you can see here she's got as a credulous servant girl, as a believing semi-invalid, as a woman seeking lost relatives, as a vamp from the country. So you can see like she took her costumes and her disguises and her personas quite seriously. Um, Here's a so unfortunately, and you can see here, she actually reached. I just went way too far. So you can see she reached, some fairly significant prominence here with her work. Now, sadly, because she was a woman in the early 20th century, she was put at risk multiple times by male mediums. She was assaulted and propositioned many times, and many of these propositions came with the promise of contacting deceased relatives or reaching enlightenment. Now, something that Rose did that was, I love this picture of her, by the way. She just has this look of like, this is all BS, right? Like, she just has this, I love the look on her face. I don't believe table tipping is all BS, but she really, man, she just kept it, kept it real. Um, Rose also testified before Congress in 1926 when a bill to outlaw fortune telling was on the table. She testified that a medium by the name of Jane Coates reported that there were table tipping sessions happening at the White House with President Coolidge. And also, some very prominent senators were participating as well. Apparently, when Rose said this, the Senate just exploded with like, "That wasn't me. No, it wasn't." So Rose really lit up the place, so to speak. All right, Zora Neale Hurston. So, Zora Neale Hurston, now she wasn't a paranormal investigator as we would know it today. Um, One could say she was a paranormal researcher in a way. Um, so she is known as one of but the most important is that she is known as one of the most prolific Black woman writers and anthropologists of the first half of the 20th century. Over the span of her 30-year career, she published numerous short stories, four novels, an autobiography, several essays, articles, and plays, and importantly for the paranormal, two books about folklore. Zora brought awareness to the topic of hoodoo, voodoo, and zombies. And it seems that in the midst of all of her anthropology work and research and writing, she became a paranormal researcher. She put boots to the ground. Um, she was able to preserve some of the most important stories and rituals that were being lost to time. Sadly, Zora, even though she was famous, she ended up dying in obscurity. And she did find her immortality through her books and anthropology work. Um, if you know the story, or you know the book The Color Purple, you know Alice Walker. Alice Walker actually played a huge role in resurrecting Zora's legacy and even finding Zora's grave. Zora was so poor when she passed away that there was really nothing left. She was in debt, and her friends that buried her couldn't afford a headstone. And Alice Walker did make sure that Zora finally got her headstone. Zora is another one I highly recommend researching further. Her life is fascinating, absolutely fascinating, including making herself seem 10 years younger so that she could finish high school. Um, so her research has become invaluable resources to scholars and historians, and honestly, the world owes her a lot. Um, Zora had this comparison. She said that she was ready to collect stories like a new broom. And that broom has helped generations of Black people understand their community and culture. And she also gave an informed perspective of culture outside of Western civilization. And she did so with compassion and love. So I highly recommend Zora Neale Hurston here. All right. Gertrude Schmeidler. I'm going to say Gertrude. She was a parapsychologist who created the sheep goat experiment in the 1940s. The experiment was designed to test the hypothesis that people who believe in ESP would be more likely to correctly identify targets that were associated with positive words. They were the sheep. Um, and then there were targets that were associated with negative words like goats. So the results of the experiment showed that participants who believed in ESP were more likely to correctly identify the sheep targets than the goat, not ghost, goat targets. So this was finding this finding provided support for the hypothesis that belief in ESP can influence the ability to perceive whoop, went too fast again, uh, to um, uh, to perceive extrasensory information. The sheep goat experiment has been replicated many times since it was first conducted, and the results have been pretty consistent. Then there's other studies that have failed to find the difference or a significant difference between the performance of sheep and goat participants. Um, yeah, so the sheep goat experiment is a classic study in parapsychology. Um, Probably one of the most important experiments in parapsychology and the paranormal. And it's generated a great deal of interest and controversy. Um, I mean, ultimately, this experiment has us now believing that belief in ESP can influence the ability to perceive extrasensory information. Um, yeah, so I would say I highly recommend looking into this. All right, let's. My slides are we're eager to get to Pamela Coleman Smith, so here we are. If you've ever seen traditional tarot cards, you have seen the work of Pamela Coleman Smith. She is probably one of the most unrecognized female contributors to the paranormal field, and she's finally getting some recognition that I'm so stoked about. So Pamela had a fascinating life compared to the average woman of her time, but she was often overlooked. I mean, she helped create one of the most important pieces um, of divination in the metaphysical and spiritual world, and also to society. So not only did she design the famous Rider-Waite Smith tarot deck, but she was also a folklorist, costume designer, set designer, poet, editor, and publisher. Um, she, her parents were, or she actually ended up becoming friends with Bram Stoker, even calling him Uncle Brammy, which is really cute. She was orphaned at a fairly young age, and the art community is well, especially Bram Stoker and a few others took her under their wing. In 1909, Pamela's tarot art was first published in what was known as just a tarot deck, and it was published by the Rider Company. Now, what's really mind blowing about this was Pamela was not paid a lot of money for her work, which is incredible to think about today, considering how famous the tarot cards are. Now, the tarot cards were the idea of A.E. Waite. So, Waite came up with the idea, Ryder published them. So, Waite and Pamela were both members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And Pamela had been a member of the Isis Urana Lodge of the Golden Dawn in 1903 with Waite. She started to show an interest in astrology in 1904, and this would obviously set the foundation for her designs of the tarot deck. So while the tarot deck today is often called the Rider-Waite deck, make it a habit to call it the Rider-Waite-Smith deck or the Rider-Smith deck to help carry on Pamela's legacy. Um, yeah. All right, let's talk about Mary Hyre. So when people think of the name Mary Hyre, you probably think of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the Silver Bridge, John Keel, Men in Black, the TNT area, maybe even aliens. I love this quote from John Keel in the Mothman Prophecies. If you wanted to find out anything about the area and its people, the quickest way was to ask Mary Hyre. Um, for those especially well versed in the Mothman story, you know who Mary Hyre is. But sometimes her name still gets eclipsed by John Keel's fame and the Mothman prophecies. Now, while he did make a significant impact with his book, Mary was right beside him along the way and had her own experiences that contributed to Keel's research. So since she was a local in Point Pleasant and she worked for the local paper, Mary was the one who kept a pulse on what was happening in the town. And she also kept John Keel updated as his main contact. So without her assistance, I mean, the Mothman Prophecies could have been a very different book. Mary had UFO experiences. She had a Men in Black experience. Her office was right next to where the Silver Bridge collapsed. So Mary was pretty important here. She ended up investigating these strange events alongside John Keel, and she would keep him updated on new occurrences, which would keep Keel coming back to Point Pleasant. So you can see how significant her role was. She spoke to witnesses who had seen Mothman, and she went to the sites where Mothman was seen. Um, yeah, so she did a lot. All right, Aiko Gibo. So, how many of you have heard of Mary King's Close in Edinburgh, Scotland? I imagine a lot of you have. How many of you have heard of the spirit of Annie and how people bring Annie dolls to make her feel better? It was Aiko Gibo who identified Annie, and she's the reason why people bring dolls to Annie this day, to this day. So if a publication has done good research, they will normally identify Aiko by name, but there are a lot of outlets that still identify Aiko as a famous medium, and they never drop her name. It's one of the most infuriating things for me, at least. At least to have some representation of a Japanese medium who contributed a lot. So what really stands out about Aiko was she actually had her own programming in Japan. So she had, segments in Japanese programming. And if you watch these segments, they are oddly similar to ghost hunting shows that we know today. So could it be that Aiko Gibo set the foundation for ghost hunting TV? Maybe. But I would say for her though, she was always wanting to do something to appease or calm down the spirits at the end, and she was eager to help them and find peace. She greatly empathized with the spirits and their stories, and it wasn't uncommon to see her in tears. Um, she wrote a book called Finding Your Guardian Spirit: The Secrets of Life After Death Revealed by Japan's Foremost Psychic. Colin Wilson wrote the foreword. She talks about how personalities don't change when one enters death. Treat spirits with respect. Yeah, definitely look her up. All right, Sarah Wilson Estep. So in the paranormal research field, there are different classifications of electronic voice phenomena like class A, B, C. The classification was created by Konstantin Radiv. It would not have been popular or adapted in the United States had it not been for Sarah Wilson Estep. She was one of the true pioneers of ITC, instrumental transcommunication, and she was not only an active participant, but she was one of the pioneering figures in the research of electronic voice phenomena and was considered to be one of the leading experts in the field. She was the founder and president of the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena, and she started publishing quarterly newsletters. Membership started with just 20 members, but then it went to several hundred, um, and it spanned about, I think, 27 states. So she published books on the subject as well. Look up Sarah Wilson Estep. Thelma Moss. Did you know Thelma Moss was a founder of the Actor Studio, which is really cool. But not only was she a Broadway actress, she was a pioneer in the field of parapsychology, and her research on topics like telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis was groundbreaking. Um, yeah, I mean, she brought Kirlian photography into the United States. Now, granted, that was a bit controversial too, because it's pretty much been debunked for the most part. But Thelma Moss led the parapsychology lab at UCLA, so she was pretty amazing. And I can't talk about amazing women in the paranormal without talking about Rosemary Ellen Guiley. She wrote over 65 books on paranormal topics and encyclopedias. She was a consultant on numerous shows, and she worked so hard to break the glass ceiling for women in paranormal media. Sadly, we lost her in 2019. Um, I met her once, and she was incredible. Um, so I highly recommend looking into Rosemary Ellen Guiley as well. All right. So, what I want everyone to take away from this presentation is that paranormal history is women's history. There are so many women that I didn't even touch on. I mean, if you look at my slide here, you know, there's still the Fox sisters, Helena Blavatsky, Ada Goodrich Freer, Eleanor Sidgwick, Louisa Rhine. I mean, and Jane Barlow. Like there's so many women here that I didn't even get a chance to touch on. I mean, you could probably give me like 4 hours and I could easily fill them with, talking about these women. And this isn't all either. So in my book, plug it in my book, but this book features 38 women who made a significant impact in paranormal research. Um, there's 38. Right now, I think in total, as I was finding women to include in the book, I kept finding more women and more women. So I have like over 100 at this point. So there's definitely going to be a volume two. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on over to my contact info. If you would like to get in touch, feel free to shoot me an email. Um, I want to thank all of you for being here today. You can hit me up on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I have been on TV a few times if you want to check out some of my appearances. I also have an Etsy shop with some books and all that good stuff. And here is my team info as well if you want to learn more about the Association of Paranormal Study. And once again, thank you everybody for coming to my talk. Thank you again to Ryan for giving me this opportunity. And I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and I'll see you around the virtual stratosphere. Thanks, everyone.